All right, Professor Swaran Singh joins us right now. Good evening, Professor Swaran Singh. Thank you so much for joining us. These are big global moments, really. I mean, just look at what's playing out. This is the world's, what the United States calls itself the world's most powerful democracy. And look at the visuals play out. It's a president of another country. It's the Venezuelan president who has been captured by the United States, by Donald Trump, as he put it. And he's been taken from the Brooklyn detention center and he is being brought straight to the New York court. You have him being assisted by, being taken by the US servicemen. You can really see, I think he's handcuffed if I'm not wrong. That's at least what it appears for me from the screen. I'll have to see it more closely. You also have a motorcade which he's part of. Swaran Singh, break this down for us, Professor.
I think very clearly for President Trump, this looks like a spectacle. And even the earlier photographs of President Maduro have shown him in handcuffs. So I'm not surprised that if he's brought to the court also in handcuffs. But it's unprecedented, it's unacceptable. And most countries, sometimes muted, sometimes more vocal, have expressed their discomfort, disagreement, condemnation, depending on which country we are talking of. It's something which I think definitely needs a much serious response to it. But I also, from the other perspective, understand that this spectacle is going to last for few days or maximum few weeks. And the focus will soon shift to the situation in Venezuela. I am assuming President Maduro will, of course, plead not guilty. It's understood. And that means the whole proceedings will then get dragged on to United States trying to produce evidence. And gradually this spectacle will recede into, I think, margins of global media debates. What happens inside Venezuela or the region and how the countries see now President Trump's threats or warnings, that I think is going to have impact much more beyond Venezuela, and it's going to have impact in the entire region of Latin America, in fact around the world in that sense, and could also shake up the whole oil market potentially, because a large chunk of oil resource of Venezuela will now be under American companies. How that actually fructifies will take certain amount of time. But this spectacle of President Trump is also an attempt to redeem the prestige of American armed forces after their last debacle in Afghanistan. So in many ways, it's intended as a PR. In many ways, it's intended to ensure that the popularity ratings of President Trump can be retrieved, can be revived, can be raised. It can also be seen in terms of focus on the midterm elections, a whole lot of reasons why this kind of orchestration is getting the kind of visibility that it is. It could have also been relatively discreet, but obviously there is no attempt to make it a discrete event. It's being published. I have seen Marco Rubio giving interviews to a whole lot of dozens of television and media, expressing what is how they view it. They clearly indicate no remorse. They are not saying they're saying it's something that did not need congressional approval. It's not war. President Trump is saying they will govern Venezuela directly by themselves,
Right.
threatening the new vice president, who's now President Delcy Rodriguez.
Absolutely. In fact, Professor, you're saying there was no remorse. I think that's a very far-fetched expectation, if I may even say this. I mean, let's just look at this. This is another thing which everybody is asking. There's an indictment which is happening in the New York court. Can there be anything but a farce which is playing out? You know, it's a court. It's where justice should be meted. It's something that the United States boasts of. But is there any possibility of justice the way scenes are playing out? Considering how Donald Trump has even bombarded, crashed into the United States also for that matter, the United Nations for that matter.
Absolutely. You know, there is no doubt that United Nations will once again prove to be ineffective, because obviously United States holds a veto power. But this bombing also should be seen in the backdrop of whole lot of other things that have happened both during the first term and the 11 months of the second term of President Trump. Have seen him constantly undermining, negating, ignoring international institutions, norms, and standards. And in that sense, after his bombing of Iran last June, uh, this again is a reflection of sort of fast forwarding that redefining of the world order, where United States remains unquestioned unipolar superpower in that sense, where might is right is the approach here. When I mentioned there is no remorse, I only meant that the kind of audacity of narratives after President Maduro has been picked up from Caracas and brought to New York is still talking in terms of him having been given the chance to surrender, chance to leave the country, and it's only his fault that he did not agree to those options, and therefore this kind of harsh action had to be taken by Delta Force, and likewise threatening the next acting president now, Delcy Rodriguez, that she should fall in line, otherwise the consequences for her could be even worse. That language, I think, is really redefining the global order, where apparently there is no longer sanctity of national sovereignty, territorial integrity. The boundaries are not no longer sanctimonious. The United States can go, and there are conversations of who will be the next, whether it is going to be Colombia or Cuba or even Iran is in conversation. And so that kind of new, world order, where then, of course, 4 years of Russian war in Ukraine looks like a kind of a not so smart strategy. Maybe, there's a conversation now that maybe they should have picked up Zelensky likewise, or what the Chinese can contemplate to do with Taiwan, etc., etc. It's very chaotic, uncertain world that this kind of spectacle seems to introduce to all of us, and in that sense, the whole lot of 80 years of post Second World War building of institutions, norms, and principles, etc., on which global stability was
Right.
built.
Professor Swaran Singh, I mean, let's just look at what Trump has been doing over the last few hours. It's as if Venezuela and what happened to Venezuela was not enough. It wasn't enough what happened with President Maduro, for that matter, how he was captured, dragged from his own bedroom. The fact remains, Donald Trump is literally at it all over again. He's given out warnings to Colombia. He's given out warnings to Iran. He's given out warnings to Taiwan. There's talks about Greenland. You have said Donald Trump is unstoppable, but is it good for democracy? Is it good for a world order which has already been reimagined, realigned, and repurposed?
Two things. One, I don't know if intentionally you missed his tweet on India, which
Correct.
we saw today morning. And of course, Trump has been Trump all the time, except that post Maduro episode, the same lingo now carries far more dangerous implications. And the nations that are being targeted by his social media, social truth tweets are going to take those things far more seriously, and calibrate what to do with the, sort of not annoying him beyond a point. Because if that audacity and of course the success of the operation, where gradually facts are unfolding as to it was not a very clean operation, lots and lots of people have died in that operation as well. President Trump himself mentioned of lots of Cubans have died in that operation. Gradually we will get to know what actually happened on the ground. And in that sense, it was not such a, surgical operation. It had enormous collateral damage for civilians and for the armed forces. I'm sure for the staff that was in presidential residence, and they focused only just picking up two people, President Maduro and his wife Celia Flores, which I don't understand, doesn't make any difference, because the same party, same ruling regime is still in control in Caracas. And United States has been talking all the time of not just armed forces but the police
Right.
being hands in glove. They are still all there, and I don't understand what fundamental difference on the ground this makes. other than humiliating an elected president. And of course, responses, as I said, around the world have been staggered, have been muted, other than Russia, for example, and sooner after that, Chinese. Even the European countries, I mean, they're not really supporting the operation, but they're not also clearly saying that this is something which is absolutely unacceptable. And, hold and just lo and behold, it could also happen to one of the European countries. Who knows? If that kind of becomes a new normal, then any other country potentially could face that kind of danger. Of course, I wouldn't I wouldn't worry too much about some of the major countries. It's not likely to happen with countries that can stand up and ensure that. Let me also mention Delta Force has had failures in at least half a dozen cases in last half a century, which are not very well advertised. So it's not that Delta Force is uh, is something that is unstoppable in many ways. Even in Syria in 2011, I remember one case where they were not successful. So there are chances that this spectacle is going to scare a lot of people, redefine the whole narrative as to how the world order, international relations are going to be conducted after this. But fundamentally, it's also true that vulnerable nations have much more to worry than countries that can stand up against United States if need be, or can ensure their own defense at all levels in that sense. But the
Okay.
whole spectacle part is something that is disturbing.
No, certainly, Professor. In fact, you mentioned about India, and that's not something that I left out. I was trying to come to it separately. But here's the big question. We heard what Donald Trump said about India as well. We've seen India's response as well. Look, between India and US, at the heart of it is oil. Donald Trump making callous, lousy statements, if I can, because that's really his way of delivering his speeches. His just, words out of his mouth, shoots out of his mouth, doesn't really think twice diplomatically. That's his style, that's his nature of doing. He's done it yet again of his references with India. But between India and United States, it's oil. And here's the big question. It's no longer only about oil. I mean, United States seems to have lost the complete ground. What India seems to be doing legitimately, United States is trying to do with other countries without any legitimacy at all.
I think the very meaning of what is legitimate changes when you talk about United States exceptionalism. The way they define norms and rules is always very different. For example, this is the only country that seeks to implement domestic law internationally, which is something that never happens. It is also the only country that, when it sanctions a particular country, also imposes what is called secondary sanctions. That means any third country doing trade with the country which is targeted by United States for sanctions would also be sanctioned. That is where the whole penalty plus the secondary sanctions on India mean that 25 plus 25%, Indian exports now face 50% tariffs, and that is unique to United States. In face of that, of course, I am underlining the fact that after Operation, Maduro, the same wordings of President Trump, which were always very Trumpian, to put it mildly, have changed their meaning, of course. Another difference that you notice that whenever President Trump has tweeted about India, he's always sought to balance it by constantly praising the Prime Minister. Of course, always pushing that India should stop buying oil from Russia. India had sought to diversify its imports of oil, and therefore have opened up to buying oil from United States as well. And I think that had gone to half a million barrels a day or so. Already, we have also signed a contract for buying $2.2 billion worth of annual gas from United States. But when it comes to buying oil from Russia, India has also been carefully calibrating. So, for example, during the summer months of June, May, etc., supplies had come down, but in November they had gone up again. So, India is very carefully calibrating, not to be seen as bandwagoning or just going by the diktats of the United States. In the past, we have had examples when pressures from United States meant India stopped buying oil from Iran, or stopped buying oil from Venezuela. But this time, when it came to pressures of not buying oil from Russia, India has withstood most of the pressures and continues to buy oil from Russia. Of course, relations with Russia are also very different compared to India's relations with Iran and particularly with Venezuela. But India has sought to carefully calibrate piecemeal without confronting. So sometimes you notice that
Very clear. India has maintained it's their national interest. If America wants to make America great again, and it's up for debate whether this really makes America great again. America itself is a divided house when it comes to this particular strategy. The Americans are not chest thumping at this moment, not all of them. You have New York's mayor, where Maduro is right now, who went very public saying it was nothing short of an act of war by the United States. India has always maintained that it is India's national interest which is first. Professor, just allow me a few minutes for viewers who would be joining us. Let's just explain to them what's happening on the screens, the visuals that are just playing out. Look at that, ladies and gentlemen. Even as we speak, Maduro should be inside a New York court where he's being indicted for narco-terrorism. You have your visuals on your screen. The left is the visuals where President Maduro, the president of Venezuela, who was captured by Donald Trump, in what he said was might of US military at display. Maduro has been taken to the New York court. The motor car which took him to the New York court on your screens. The left or the right side, you have Maduro being brought in from the Brooklyn detention center to New York, getting off the chopper. You see him handcuffed. I believe that he's handcuffed. I can't very clearly see it, but he seems to be handcuffed. He's being escorted, brought in, and being taken to the court by US servicemen. I'm being joined by Professor Swaran Singh as well as Ambassador Baswati Mukherjee. Thank you very much, Ambassador Mukherjee, for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, we are continuing our live coverage of what's playing out in a country that calls itself the biggest, most powerful democracy of the world. Ambassador Mukherjee, what goes on your mind when you see these visuals? You may say it's Venezuela, you may say it's a president of Venezuela, but very, very, very powerful visuals coming out in 2025 from the United States.
Well, such visuals happened decades ago when Noriega was picked up in Panama. That was a long time ago. And Panama, as a country, does not have the same kind of importance or status as Venezuela. But be that as it may, it was a violation of international law. Then, that was George W. Bush, and now by President Trump. What has happened is that during that period, it would appear that the old world order has broken down completely. Multilateral institutions no longer have much relevance. And international law, which is supposed to be safeguarded by the UN Charter and the UN, seems to have broken down because earlier, for instance, the invasion of Iraq, etc., these used to be taken to the UN Security Council and they would be authorized for any particular reason, like, let's say, there is a danger to international peace and security. They claimed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, etc. In this particular case, it looks like a commando operation where a sitting president who appears to have committed some pretty serious crimes, according to what I'm reading on social media, but be that as it may, that is for his country to decide, and his wife have been virtually, if not abducted, taken against their will to US to be tried in a US domestic court, leaving a power vacuum in Venezuela, where whether the election, they say, was not fully democratic, was semi-rigged, whatever, the point here is that that is for the Venezuelan people to decide at the next election. So we are witnessing, in fact, the breakdown of the old world order and the emergence of a new global disorder, which is what happened between World War I and World War II. So I hope and pray that these developments do not mean that in 2026 we are faced with increasing global conflicts, taking the world closer and closer to an international conflict. Because when, between the two wars, when you had the emergence of a global disorder, they then led to a catastrophic war and the setting up of institutions to prevent another war through the UN Charter, etc., or through the UNESCO, where I was ambassador, where the charter says that because the idea of war begins in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that these ideas should be eliminated, which was a great preamble for a great institution, the UNESCO. So I am just watching these visuals with the same amount of uh, shock and amazement as all of us here across the world, here in your studio, you, I, and Professor, we are watching because it seems surrealistic to see a person who was president of Venezuela day before yesterday being paraded and marched in this manner. We also saw photographs on President Trump's, I think he calls it the Truth and Social Harmony post, where we saw this man blindfolded, mm, shackled, and amazingly carrying what appeared to me a small bottle of mineral water in his shackled hand. Uh, to me, that was also very pathetic. And
Hmm.
also the bravado by which he said Happy New Year as he was coming out. I heard him in English as he was being taken out of his, uh, taken towards the prison cell, it seemed to me. Um, this is going to have a lot of ramifications because Venezuela is not Panama. Venezuela is a complex country. Latin America itself is a complex region. For those who have served there, would tell you. And um, I think those who have been colonized in the past, and we know that, all of us sitting here in your studio, uh, they are extremely sensitive to external interference, in this case, an external kidnapping of a head of state. How it's going to end up is difficult to say, but I would say that Maduro would be probably sentenced to a fairly long term in American jail. Whether Trump's successor will eventually set him free, I don't know.
Right.
Uh, It has been done by Trump to one person, I'm told. One convicted person was set free by Trump uh, soon after he took over.
Right, Ambassador. In fact,
This
allow
is
me to just interrupt you at this point. There's some visuals that are just coming on our screen. You have the New York court. These are the visuals from outside the New York court where Maduro is being tried, where he is indicted for narco-terrorism. Professor Swaran Singh, if I can come to you, let's just, while both of you have spoken about how this is played out internationally, how this is played out within Venezuela and the United States as well, at the heart of it is oil. And is the fact that Venezuela holds the key to, say, 20% of oil reserves of the world, but churns out just 1% of crude. How much of that can Donald Trump change? And if he does manage to change it under duress the way he seems to be moving towards, it's going to change the world order and the way the world really trades with oil. Forget about reimbursements of just United States in the cost to run Venezuela, so it be.
I think let me, for the sake of clarity for your viewers, mention that for all modernization and progress, all nations would require enormous amounts of energy. And the world, as of now, remains enormously dependent on fossil fuels, which is crude oil. And so much so that from 2015 Paris Climate Change Summit, nations have gradually marginalized the debate on phasing out of fossil fuels. In fact, the last two summits hardly make any mention of it. And therefore, United States understands that the energy around the world would enormously continue to depend on fossil fuels, which is oil. Second point, from about 12 to 13 years, when the water fracking technology made it possible for United States to exploit its shale oil, as the prices of oil also went up $60 a barrel plus, that became viable and United States became a net exporter of oil. And that also shows how it lost interest in West Asia. So from that perspective, yes, Venezuela, which is now being flaunted around the world as a country holding largest reserves, I think 300 billion plus barrels of reserves, now coming under American companies, which originally were, of course, in command of Venezuelan oil, and story goes back when it was nationalized, etc. That's where the confrontation began. Now, if OPEC is already under American influence, which exports 50% of global energy, oil, etc., and then plus Venezuela, it would give enormous command to United States President to ensure the supply and pricing of oil in world market. And that will of course also have impact on China, which is world's largest importer, and India, which is also a second largest importer of crude oil, etc., etc. So in that sense, yes, potentially it could bring enormous advantages to United States, but it's also true that in last about 7-8 years, since the first term of President Trump, the production and export of oil of Venezuela had declined sharply, and some of the bells are no longer functional, and reviving them takes time and investment. So it's not that the dividends are going to fall into American companies' profits within next few weeks or months. It is going to take certain amount of time. But yes, potentially, since we know that energy and crude oil are going to be a dominant source of power, this would bring United States enormous advantage. And it's not just oil. Venezuela has enormous amounts of reserves of iron ore, of coal, of gold, of copper, fresh water, another very, very important source. So it's a very powerful, resourceful country. That's where Ambassador was mentioning Panama was a very different case. And in Panama, 1988, an American naval officer was shot dead in Panama. So it's much more different case where Americans had to go out and take some action because their soldiers were shot dead in
There was
Panama.
An immediate trigger despite
yes, but
the
here,
geopolitics at
it's
play.
a very different story in this case.
Right. In fact, Ambassador, if I can just come to you, we were, Professor and I, we were just discussing this a while back, but if we can get you on this as well, just the sheer audacity of what has unfolded and the manner in which it has unfolded. Over the last few months, the world has seen Donald Trump slap tariffs for what could be their legitimate way of trading in oils. Every country, a sovereign country, has the right to put their interests first and decide how they want to go forward. And here you have a president who calls himself the president of the world's most powerful democracy, capture Maduro from Venezuela, and not a word on democracy in that global address.
I think it's important to understand that President Trump has a completely different approach to democracy and to America's preeminent place in the world. In other words, for him, there are two kinds of international law, one for United States and one for the rest of the world. That is something that we have to appreciate. But I wanted to add that as far as Venezuelan oil is concerned, the US oil companies over the last 24 hours have shown no enthusiasm for going into Venezuela. And the reason for that is precisely what Professor Swaran Singh said. To redevelop the infrastructure and to extract the very heavy oil that Venezuela possesses is going to take more than 6 to 7 years and cost billions of dollars, by which time Trump will not be in power. There could be a different government in the United States. And would the American oil companies want to take that kind of investment to Venezuela, considering that Trump is not going to get a third term? So there is no rush. And actually, there is only one company, that is an American oil company, that is working over there. We also have investment in Venezuelan oil. But the point here is, as Professor Swaran Singh said, the oil markets are not going to be flooded with Venezuelan oil, not for the next 5 to 6 years, long after Trump is gone. That's one thing. Secondly, as far as Panama was concerned, and I think Professor Swaran Singh, it was in 89, not 88. I was in New York at that time, in 89, when this happened. In this particular case, although the spin was given that Maduro was betrayed by his bodyguards, actually it turns out that more than 80 soldiers, Venezuelan soldiers, were shot dead in the attempt to kidnap him. So it was not that he was handed over to the Americans by his own people. That's not true. The truth has emerged now. It is true, however, so they claim, that no American was injured and only one helicopter was hit. That's it. But the point is not that. The point is, what now? Because he has said, Trump, that he does not want to get back the person who stood against Maduro and who was supposed to have won the election. He doesn't want to bring back the lady who got the Nobel Peace Prize. He is trying to negotiate with the same people who are Maduro's friends and die-hard supporters, including the vice president. So what would happen is that when Trump would finish his term, some deal would be worked out by which the next American president would pardon him and he would come back. I don't see him spending 25 years in jail as he would be sentenced. He would be sentenced, he and his wife, to 20 to 25 years in the worst jail they have in New York City. It's a very notorious jail that they put him up, a very dangerous jail. But I don't see that happening. But in the meantime, it gives wrong signals to regional hegemons to do what they like to. Because if the international law only applies to strong countries who like to bully others, there are other countries who I don't want to name here on national television, who are also regional hegemons, who are also eyeing other countries.
Okay.
So if if it happens today in Venezuela, tomorrow it could happen in a different part of the world with regard to another country. We are
Right.
setting a very bad precedent here.
In
That's
fact, while
concerned.
you're mentioning that point, Ambassador, Professor Singh, if I can get you in, there's a breaking news that's coming in. Latin America's largest Venezuelan armed gangs and cartels are moving towards the streets of Caracas to fight pro-US officials.
Uh, I think
Would you
it's
break this
also
down for us?
I think it's also important to understand that whatever is being given to us through media is largely American version. American media being enormously influential and powerful and right now has enormous access to Venezuela. Is that version that is coming out? We also heard that the interior minister of Venezuela, uh, Diosdado Pobelo, had mentioned that several large number of people were killed during that operation by Delta Force. When I said it was a clean operation, I only meant there was no damage done to the Americans. So, for American perspective, this, as President Trump described, it was a clean operation in that sense. Now, as for your question as to criminal gangs are moving in favor of United States towards Caracas, fundamentally there is a situation on the ground in Venezuela, in Caracas, which is of enormous uncertainty. And enormous uncertainty, instability is ideal for immediate explosive increase in violence on the ground. And definitely these criminal gangs or drug traffickers gangs would find that as a ideal time to again redistribute their influence among themselves or
Out
wield
what we are
more
getting at
influence
this
in
point
politics.
again, Professor, because just to be clear, these Latin American gangs, the armed gangs and cartels, a word that Donald Trump himself has used multiple times over the last few days and months for that matter, according to the news that we're getting, are moving to fight pro-US officials. So basically, even the Venezuelan leaders who they think are standing hand in hand with the United States. So this is, as you were mentioning, only sending Venezuela further in turmoil. And it's not just about Venezuela.
True, indeed. It's also important to underline that Venezuela is not the only country that US has over a period of time been blaming for drug trafficking, etc., etc., except that it has a very different approach to different countries. There could be a country where a pro-American president is now sitting and was known for drug trafficking. China could be another big example. I mean, Trump has also been talking of fentanyl being supplied from Chinese, but the approach to China is very different. So here, definitely, we understand that there is an enormous support base just by picking up the president and his wife. The system on the ground has not suddenly changed, and therefore, I'm sure there is enormous groundswell in terms of pro-Maduro as well. And they would, of course, be coming to the streets, whether to protest or to fight. So fundamentally, pro or against United States forces in Venezuela will have now no bars anymore. And that is going to create enormous violence on the ground. And all I'm saying is that if you were trying to control drugs trade, drug trafficking, then more violence is not going to solve anything. And therefore, taking the president out of the country, creating chaos and instability is only going to make Venezuela even more stronger hub for drug trafficking in that sense. And that instability is not going to disappear tomorrow. It's going to continue for a longer period of time. And Venezuela is not the world's biggest hub. I mean, you can look at neighboring Pakistan here. Afghanistan, Pakistan is another area which is known for drug trafficking. But, the relations with Pakistan are extremely hunky-dory. So it's a very subjective, very, very unpredictable way of dealing with the countries. And therefore, President Trump has picked up Venezuela,
Right.
declared them, he even called President Maduro that he's himself heading certain cartels and he's directly involved in drugs trafficking, etc., etc. It's very whimsical fundamentally.
Okay. Professor Swaran Singh, as well as Ambassador Baswati Mukherjee, thank you very much for joining us, for your time. These are very, very telling visuals playing out live as we report this. Thank you so much. Quickly, breaking news that's coming in. US Vice President JD Vance house has been attacked in Ohio. One person has been taken into custody, according to US media reports. The Vice President and his family were not present at the residence at the time. Authorities say the suspect did not gain entry into the home. Visuals from the spot show damage to windows at the Vice President's residence, though officials are yet to confirm that exactly caused it. Law enforcement agencies have launched an investigation to determine whether the incident was a targeted attack on JD Vance or his family. More details are awaited.